Welcome to Green Kite's Ask the Experts. In this podcast series, we cut through the jargon and we try and get straight to what really matters in our industry. So if you are having issues, you're navigating tricky changes, then you're in the right place. Come listen to us and we'll help you tackle those questions in insurance, one episode at a time.
Welcome to the latest in our sessions of GK podcasts, and this time I'm delighted to introduce you to the concept of capability assessments, what they are, how to approach them, and how they can support your business aspirations. I'm delighted to be joined by two of my GK colleagues who have extensive experience in undertaking capability assessments and remediation activities across the insurance market, Claire Carpenter and Becky Bennett. Claire, would you like to tell us all a bit about yourself?
Yes, hi, I'm Claire Carpenter. I've been in the market now 20 years in compliance for my sins, latterly working as a consultant, working with large insurers and mostly sort of MGAs and insurtechs.
Becky, would you like to give a brief introduction about your skills?
So I'm Becky. I am a client solutions partner at Green Kite. I am a business architect by trade, and I have worked in the insurance industry for over 15 years now, starting in general insurance and more recently coming into the more of a Lloyd's market focus, working as a business analyst, project manager, all sorts of different roles within change, but landing within the business architecture role in the more recent years.
So where do capability assessments fit in the insurance industry, given that it's constantly evolving? We have emerging technologies, the use of AI, increased desire for data, regulatory pressures, working practice changes, operational models changing, and new products constantly being developed. We're ultimately all striving to remain compliant, relevant, or market leading. So with that in mind, how can capability assessments help you make your business better? Becky, let's start with you. Can you explain the concept of capability assessments to those listening and why an organisation would choose to embark on undertaking these types of assessments?
Yeah, so a capability assessment can sound big and scary and sometimes quite expensive. The reality is a capability assessment is the opportunity to have somebody, preferably independent, come into your organisation to do a health check, for want of a better word, that will look at the 6 pillars of what we look at in a capability assessment. So we'll look at people, process, technology, data, partners, and regulatory responsibilities. We'll then look at each of the areas that you want us to look at. So we can look at everything from a full end to end, or we can look at individual areas that have an issue, and we'll produce you a report at the end that says, here's what our findings were, here's some issues that we identified, and here's some recommendations on how we think that you can fix it.
So Becky, is the driver a problem that's been identified within the business, or is it something else?
Anything can be a trigger for a capability assessment. So you can start a capability assessment because you've identified there's a problem. So you could say there's a problem in a particular area. So for example, we've been into organisations before where they've said we have a particular problem with due diligence. So when we're onboarding people, we are currently losing clients because our processes are taking too long. We're asking questions time and time again. Everything is really complex. So we can go in and we'll look at just that individual area. We'll look at the processes you follow. We'll look at the data you collate. We'll look at the technology you use. We'll look at, are you meeting your regulatory requirements? And we'll identify what we perceive are the issues in that area by talking to lots of people. And we'll produce your report and hopefully a project plan so that you can turn it around. The other point is, if you just want to improve, you want to do things better, you want to look at, is there a way that we can make things work? You potentially have a project that's going wrong that you can, you want to rectify, you want to put into recovery. Anything can be a trigger. There's never a right time to do a capability assessment, but it is a really good point where you can stop, breathe, and have this health check of everything that's going on in your organisation.
Thanks, Becky. Claire, there's been a lot of talk in the Lloyd's market around independent validation of the Lloyd's RIO rating. With the move to self-attestation across the market, how important is it for firms to really understand and evidence their capabilities in more detail?
Really, really important. Having done a few of these reviews, there's quite a lot of gap between people's perception of what's going on in terms of the process and that rating versus the reality. There's also a lot of confusion between what processes are saying and how those things get pulled together. So really important, and Lloyd's will be on you and wanting you to evidence that those assessments. And I think at the first stage, everybody sort of did the first review of that assessment, added that in, and now it's a time to go through those and validate everything that's been said in there, make sure it all cross-references between policies and other procedures, and really make sure that you've really got an accurate assessment of the risk profile, the maturity level within the business across all 13 pillars. Lloyd's will be checking, albeit it's a self-attestation, they will be checking.
And how does it work when you're a firm that has given an attestation of advanced, but actually a capability assessment comes in underperforming? What would you do within that kind of organisation?
And I think that's a really good question. And I think that the validation, and I think what's important around these capability assessments is a business-led opportunity to rectify things. So it's not a case of writing a report and saying, well, you're not mature. Most likely in these situations, what occurs is actually there's a process that just needs updating, or some very simple fixes. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not mature, and it's not something you now need to then necessarily go and start reporting to Lloyd's and saying that you're not against those attestation. Quite often these are just quick fixes and pragmatic fixes that can help evidence that validation. And very rarely when I've done one of these reviews have I ever found someone being completely out of kilter with the rating, but it's mostly evidence and process based that the issues.
And the regulator or Lloyd's would be supportive if there was improvement activities, naturally, I assume.
You're absolutely right. And they're very encouraging on that side. And, despite what people may perceive of the regulator, having been in the Lloyd's market for many years myself, actually you find them very pragmatic and very open about those things. And they would very much be supportive of external validation for these attestations, because ultimately it's going to drive what business can be written through the organisation. It's actually critical for the business that they get it right. This isn't about rubber stamping. This is about really getting under the hood of whether or not your business is mature in each of those 13 pillars.
Just to add into what Claire said as well, although I've not been involved in anything that has a RIA attestation, we have been involved when the regulators have come in to check how a firm is performing. And if you don't have one of these reviews, or you don't have a plan in place to improve it, they tend to look harder, they look at more. If you can present them with a plan and say, we know what our problems are, we know what the issues we're facing are, here's our plan of how we're going to fix it based on this independent report that we had, and we have had evidence of this happening at a client that we have been at previously, they come in, tick a box and say, brilliant, we'll come back in a couple of years and make sure you've done everything you say you were going to do. And that was that, rather than them looking in more detail and more depth.
That I've seen that personally myself as well. Actually what you've done is you've identified a problem yourself, and then you've taken steps to address those gaps, and the regulator does look very fondly on that. And I think also just to mention that obviously we've got these 13 principles that everyone's going down and self-attestating, but actually there's also quite a lot of crossover with some of these. For underwriting governance, for example, sanctions checking kind of falls into underwriting governance and risk appetites, and often these things cross pillars, and if they're done in silos then it can cause issues in terms of knock-on effects to other principles. So it's really important actually to take some of these as a more broader concept, and also understanding what the market's doing, what that benchmark is of where your peers are, because some of these principles from Lloyd's have been stretch targets for firms, and actually there's other businesses within that your scope that actually might be doing something differently, or might be further behind or more advanced.
We're using the term capability assessments, but also we've got terms like validations, assurance, independence reviews, and they're words that come up a lot within the kind of assurance and compliance space, Claire. How do they differ, or don't they? Are they the same thing?
Well, I think it depends on the terms of reference of the review. So, for example, internal audit have very specific and very rigid terms of reference for their reviews and what they're looking to get at and how they risk rate those things. So an internal audit, on a third line basis would be very different to perhaps a capability assessment that we would do. It would be instigated by the business, would be a very pragmatic business-led review, whereas on an internal audit, it'd be much more sort of top-down and aligned to a very specific group and very scope and a very specific set of requirements. You can use internal audits in your capability assessments, and I recommend that you do that to make sure that you're aligning all of the key risk areas. But the impetus is often different. But internal audits are very specific. But a compliance review could be very similar to a capability assessment, but it's the instigation and the purpose of why that review happens, and it all can be used for assurance activities across all three lines of defence.
Thanks, Claire. Becky, capability assessments sound very, very grand and like a significant piece of work requiring significant investment from a company. Is that always the case?
No, definitely not. It's definitely not the case. So I have got experience, and we have got experience at Greenkite of going into clients to do all types of capability assessments. The capability assessment is a process that you follow to get you to your outcome. So we could do a capability assessment, and we have done, looking at the full end-to-end working of an organisation. So we could do the full end-to-end sales to closure of something. When you look at a delegated function, how it works, how the assurance works, how the borderline management works, how it all hangs together. You could also go in and look pointedly at individual pieces. So you could say, I've got a particular problem with borderline management. I can't get the data out that I need, and I don't understand why it is such a problem. Instead of just hopping straight into, I need new technology, let's go and buy a new system, let's get it in as quick as we physically can, you can have one of these assessments, and it will give you an insight to the whole piece. So is your people structured properly? Are you able to support any queries that come out from borderline management? How does your data hold together? How does the data flow from start to finish? How are we liaising with our cover holders and making sure that the data quality that we've got is at the right level? The systems and technology that we have to hang together, is it all working in the right way? Have we got the right technology? Can we make small changes, or do we need big changes to that? And how are we doing with our regulations? Are we making sure that all of our validations are correct, that everything hangs together? And finally, partners. Are we doing this all in-house when really we could be doing something out-house? We could be getting somebody else to offer us a service to make these things better. So you could go and look full end-to-end. You could look very kind of linearly into one area that you know is a particular problem that you want to solve. And the one thing I will say is a capability assessment doesn't always lead to big transformation programs. It can, if that's what the organisation desires, but it can also lead to small changes, albeit that. So that could be process, that could be a restructure, that could be just the way that one system links to another, small technology changes that could really transform the whole function or the whole way that one area works. So the capability assessment is the way that we string all of this stuff together. It can be on any scale. It could also be when you're setting up a new business. I know, Karen, I don't know if you want to add in the parts that you're doing at the moment with one of our clients where we're going into a completely new organisation, but it can be used for anything.
So we're doing a piece of work at the moment on for a new setup of an MGA platform that are looking to use group company services. So what we're doing at the moment is trying to work out what can the group company offer, and what does the kind of new MGA platform need to have within its wheelhouse, and designing kind of a target operating model and assessing what level of capability the firm needs to actually build in-house. And I think that's a really key element, because it's actually around, not everybody needs to be gold-plated. Actually, some people just need to be compliant. Some people want to be market leading, and there's a variety of risk appetites kind of in the mix there. So each function, each capability can have a different level of expectation and a different kind of remit to achieve. And I think that's really important. So not everyone needs to be market leading, because that's just not how the business works. It's down to you and your individual appetite for growth.
It's really important as part of the capability assessment to work out the reasons for doing it. So one of the first things that we do when we go into an organisation is to say, why do you want this capability assessment to take place? Is it because we're spending too much money in an area? Is it because the strategy is to change? Do we have a particular problem? Is it that we just want to have a look and see if we can improve? And looking at that strategy at the beginning means that when you're doing the capability assessment, you're looking at how things are affecting that end goal of where you want to be. And any recommendations or any plans or any project designs that come off the end of a capability assessment can be done in a way that will support that strategy going forward, so the way that you want your organisation to be designed.
Claire, in your experience within the assurance arena, can you give us examples of kind of smaller capability assessments that you've been involved in so far at Green Kites?
Yeah, sure. I think consumer duty has been a really interesting one, because we've done capability assessments for large insurers and quite a few small insurtechs and MGAs, and those projects vary very differently. And actually, the pragmatic, a small MGA with 4 or 5 staff, they haven't got the people or the infrastructure to be able to do some of the snazzier things that these large insurers have got the capability to do. A good example of that is customer understanding outcome 3, where you need to test your communications. Now, obviously, a huge insurer has got a lot of budget to be able to then use external providers to do that, to do a lot of focus groups and all of that good stuff, which is fantastic. But for smaller firms, actually they can do guerrilla testing. So they can go around and ask friends and family and colleagues to test the understanding of the wording or that communications with customers. And part of that capability assessment that we do here at Green Kite is about understanding what the scope and remit is of the project, and what tools and resources you have at your disposal, and coming up with pragmatic solutions to help you to deliver the requirements, but in a really sensible and really proportionate way. And we've done that for quite a few different firms, and some want to be more gold-plated than others in certain areas. And again, we take all of that into account, and I think that's very important. And again, on sort of fair value as well, we're seeing a lot of smaller firms really sort of struggling with trying to sort of evidence some of that external validation, and that's where we come in around benchmarking with other firms of similar size, and we can give really good kind of anonymized benchmarking to support these smaller firms that haven't got the big budgets to be able to support that. And we do that by going through hand in hand with the teams in those businesses.
Thanks, Claire. So, Becky, if I'm a firm and I'm about to embark on a capability assessment, what do I need to be thinking about before embarking on this activity?
The first thing, in my opinion, that you need to think about is the people that you are going to work with. My opinion is the most important thing for a capability assessment is that you have someone completely independent come in and do it. The reason for that is because you take away any emotional attachments that you may have to the firm. You take away any prehistoric ideas of change that have happened before, and you bring in a completely new and fresh perspective. But what's really important is finding a partner that works with you. It's very easy to jump to kind of one of the standard people that you would go and work with. But bringing in somebody who really understands your business, really understands the market that you work in, and really understands what you're trying to achieve from it, that is the first thing, that is the most important thing that happens. The next part is to make sure you know the reason why you're asking for this capability assessment and you're asking for this review. What do you want to get out of it? And what do you want to be produced at the end of it? It could be that you just want a report that says this is how bad it is, and then or how good it is. Sorry, on the negative there. This is how good it is. This is the problem areas that we found. You just want a report so that you know what the situation is right now, and then you can make a decision about what you're going to do. It could be that you already know that you have particular issues that you need to fix, so you want a project designed at the end of it so that you can make it better in the future. Or it could be that you want a full transformation to take place, and you want us to be coming in and thinking about these reports and what changes that you can make, which will be a longer term piece of change. So knowing who your partners are going to be, knowing the reason why you're starting it, and knowing what you want to get out the end of it. I think the biggest shame that could happen is that you go through this work, you design how it's going to work, you complete it, you make the reports, and then nothing comes off the end of it. It's such a rich piece of information that comes at the end when these reports are created, that to just lose that is quite a shame at the end.
Yeah. And I think one of the other things that we need to really think about is the business strategy. We touched on it earlier. Are we just keeping the lights on? Are we trying to be regulatory compliant and not get the FCA after us? Are we trying to be above the competition? Are we really trying to leverage competitive advantage? I think if you know where your end game is, I think it makes it much, much easier to assess the capability against that end game and then see the kind of route for improvement.
Absolutely.
Claire, do you have any thoughts on what else you'd like to see firms doing before starting this activity?
I mean, I think your point's absolutely great in terms of that kind of competitive advantage. You know, are you going to get some competitive advantage from implementing a system and narrowing that process down, or there's loads of opportunities to do that. And I think also Becky's point of sometimes the report will actually just be a validation that you are doing things right. We'll always have other ideas and additional things that you might want to think about. But actually, there's been 2 recent reviews that I've done, one on sanctions and one on vulnerable customers, where actually the report was largely really positive and reinforcing of really good activity that's been happening. So it's not always a negative, but I think your point's absolutely critical, that if you're going to procure a capability assessment, that everybody's aligned, the board's aligned about what they're looking for, the business want to understand what they want to get out of it as well. And it should be also not just, are you compliant, yes or no, but it should also be about how can we get that competitive advantage with the processes we've got in place. And that's one thing at Greenkite we're really good at, is because we've been around the block a bit, and we can see actually best practice across the market and give suggestions for how things might be able to be improved.
So the one thing that I would add to what Claire has said as well is that engagement piece. So making sure that everybody is aware of what you're doing, why you're coming in to do it, and what the outcomes are going to be, so that when we do meet with the business, what we try to do is take minimal amounts of time from the business and pull everything together. We meet with as many people as possible, and we come up with that original stakeholder list when we first come in and we have the discussions. But having open, honest conversations with people where people know that we are completely independent and we're able to take that, the ideas from people, and we're able to pull all of that together, is really important. And if people don't understand why we're coming in, then it could taint or it could change the outputs that we get out the end. So having that positive start right at the beginning, being really clear, really helps.
And I think that's really important as well, because this is why it's not an audit. We're not here to score you. We're not here to assess you. We're not here to tell you you're doing things wrong. We're actually here to help you drive improvement. So the only way you can drive improvement is by being kind of open and honest, and having a desire for continuous improvement. And I think that culture of no blame and just how do we move this forward is really, really important within the organisation. And that tone needs to be set from the top of the organisation, because it's very, very difficult to go into a business who are on the defensive and understand where they are in their kind of development life cycle.
I completely agree with that, Karen, because I think actually I'm starting to see more instigations of these types of reviews from business leaders, underwriting and operations, whereas normally, historically, I would see them coming from compliance because they had to, or because, the regulator. Actually seeing more proactivity from business functions wanting that best practice, wanting that validation against almost sometimes their own internal department's opinions of stuff. So it actually can be a really good catalyst for change and a really good cohesion. And quite a few times doing these reviews, actually you'll speak to one team and they've got an absolute fixed view about what needs to happen, and they haven't spoken to the adjacent team that actually has got a completely different view. And actually one thing we can do with these reviews is kind of bring those things together and hear out each department and make sure that they're cohesive.
Thanks, Claire. So we talked a little bit about the output from a capability assessment, because there's not much point doing a capability assessment unless you're going to do something with what you learn along the way. We talked about big transformational projects, and we've also talked about kind of small tactical change. If I turn to Becky first, once you've done a capability assessment, how do you help a business decide how to move forward from the outcome?
Depends what the findings are. So one thing that we always try to bear in mind is that when you are producing the end output and you are designing whether we think it needs to be transformation, it needs to be project, it can be small tactical, it could even be a program of small changes that are happening throughout a longer period of time. You need to take into account budget, strategy, and desire to change, how hard change is going to be, how open the business is going to be to change. So that is really taking that rich information that you've got that comes out of these reports and working with professionals to work out how are we going to change this, how are we going to make it better. We will put in benchmarking where we have gone with our previous experience and pulled all that together, and we will say this is the way we think that you could work, but it needs to be business decisions on how a lot of this stuff works. So I'm going to say it's a program of change, but it doesn't need to be massive. Creating that stuff that comes out the back end of how you change this, what you need to design to improve it going forward, it needs to be done alongside whoever it was that brought you in, whether that be a functional area or the exec team that bring you in, and then you design that to go forward. Just to be really clear, that doesn't need to be really big pieces of change, although it has been previously, and we've designed kind of 3 to 5 year programs of work that can come out at the end of these. It can also be really small changes where you say, change this process, and I think we can improve this going forward. It's really important to remember, especially when you're working with people at MGAs, where every pound matters, you're a small organisation, that you don't have to spend lots of money on doing big tech transformations and jumping straight to how do we automate this whole process and make sure that we've got the best tech available. Focusing on your organisation and the way that it's structured and the way that your data hangs together can actually give you a lot more benefit than jumping straight into massive technology changes.
Claire, do you have anything else to add on that?
I completely agree, and I think MGAs are a really good example. Of limited budget and limited number of staff. I mean, there's a recent project of let's look at the border area to see what we can do with that to then add in additional requirements for conduct MI, for example, and actually standardising some of those fields. Is actually not that big a piece of work, but actually has transformed the quality of data coming out of that. There's now you'll be able to use those border for multiple purposes. So I think there's some really good tactical things that we're really experienced at working with some of these smaller firms, where actually end up having quite good innovative ways of to try and achieve the end result, but on a much smaller pragmatic basis.
And the problem with capability assessments is all of the areas are interconnected, and I think that's one of the things that you'll find when you see results of any capability assessment. You're very dependent on processes or sub-processes. You're dependent on different functions. You're dependent on different people and roles and responsibilities. It can be very hard to navigate your way through where to start. You can't change a process if you haven't got the people to run the process. You can't implement the new technology if you haven't got the people to sit down within the business and work out what the requirements are. How do you kind of work in an environment where actually there's so many dependencies on other areas for remediation activities? How do you put a plan together to really help the business move forward, Becky?
It's working alongside the key stakeholders. So by going through and looking at all of the 6 pillars that I mentioned before, everything hangs together. So if we go into an organisation, I'll use experience that I have before. I'm going to use the due diligence experience that I have. So if when we went in to look at the due diligence piece, this company was losing business. So people were leaving them and they were not able to onboard people quick enough because it was taking so long and they were asking for the same piece of information. Sometimes we had experience of 15 to 20 times being asked for the same piece of information. So we had to look at everything, how it all hangs together. You have to look at the organisation and how it's structured. Do you have enough people? Are the people skilled in the right way? Do you have enough seniority in there? Do you have people that can make informed decisions, or do you have people that are just filling out a tick box on a spreadsheet, which is how most due diligence happens at the moment? Then we look at the process that people follow. So you look at from start to finish, How do we get the data in? How do we get the information? How do we make sure we've got everything from a cover holder? How do we pull everything through and make sure we can make the informed decisions? How do we make sure all of the correct parties in the business are doing the right thing? So how do we make sure compliance are answering questions when they need to? How do we make sure finance are available when we need them to be available? How do we know people have the right accountability for their part of their process? What technology do we have that sits around it? Are we running our whole due diligence process on a spreadsheet, or do we have a system in place that will manage all of that stuff coming in and managing those approvals that are coming out the back end? The data we're collecting so many times, and especially in this situation that we had at this client, you see all of this information that is gathered on onboarding goes into a file and gets put aside, and then at renewal we start again and we start afresh, because all of that information is put somewhere and it's hidden. But it doesn't need to be, because if a policy lasts for 5 years, you've got that on our books for 5 years. We don't need to ask for that at renewal. Do we need to have an updated version of stuff? So looking at how all of that is stored and saved and used, looking at, are we making sure all of the questions we're asking, all of everything that we're answering is in line with our regulators' expectations? Are we doing everything we should be? Are we doing too much in some cases? Are we doing too little? Are we doing everything we need to do to make sure we onboard somebody? And then lastly, as I said previously, is partners. Could we use somebody else to do this? Could we outsource small parts of the process? Could we have people doing bits that we trust, become a partner with us to do these parts? Could we outsource it to somewhere else in the organisation? Is there someone that is better placed to be doing that part of the process? Once you pull all of that together and you have this insight on how it can be improved and how we can move to a better business and make sure that we fix all of the issues that are identified, you can design these smaller programs, quick win changes. We can put those quick wins in as quickly as possible, and then you can design the bigger changes. If there's tech that needs to be done, it's never just a 2-3 week piece of work. It's always a longer piece of work. So you then design from the appetite that's taken from the people that bring you in. We then design how that program of work and the change in delivery looks across the next kind of, say, 6 months to a year.
Claire, I don't think we can do a podcast without mentioning consumer duty. We've done a number of consumer duty projects that have been stood up and are now in their close down piece. But consumer duty needs to be embedded throughout an organisation to really make it work. To what extent do you think capability assessment can really support consumer duty and good customer outcomes within a firm?
I think it's absolutely critical. We can see through the gap market and the FCA's intervention on fair value, which obviously is a core part of consumer duty, and we can see that the implications of getting that wrong, and the fact that some gap providers have been prohibited from selling voluntarily, from selling temporarily. We can see that can have major impacts on a business, and I think that there was a lot of work to do to deliver consumer duty across the market. And as I said earlier, actually, there's a number of different types and sizes of firms, and the implementation of consumer duty can look very different across those different types of firms. And I think a stop and check, health check, given what we know about the FCA's recent interventions, and there's going to be more coming on other types of products around fair value and those product assessments, and having looked at quite a few of those across the market, there does need to be some real, digging around and real challenging of oneself around how well that was done, how those delivery points were delivered in line with what the expectations were versus the actual reality of that change. So I think consumer duty is a pillar across pretty much everything, even when you look at underwriting governance, or you look at bordereau management, or any of these functions within the business. Actually, consumer duty has to come on here to try and make sure we're reducing harm and getting that information out from the business and being able to utilize that data to improve products and services to customers. And I think that's what ends up happening, is a lot of these sort of lower level processes can prohibit the proper implementation of consumer duty. So a health check at this point is really, really critical on your consumer duty steps, particularly sort of outcome 1 and 2. And actually that challenge to the business, because having looked at quite a few of these, there's no challenge or actions in these fair value assessments. There's no change. It's just self-justification of what has existed already. And whilst that might have been okay previously, now the FCA is really digging around this. So it's important to take a step back, allow an independent review to happen to show you where you are against the market and what exposure you potentially have.
Just adding on to what Claire said there, I think we're really noticing as a massive driver at the moment about the MI that is required for consumer duty. So a lot of people are coming to us saying, we just cannot get this MI that is required. We can't do the product mapping. We're really struggling. And we've been asked to come into clients to have a look at the reasons why we can't get this data out. How can we fix it? How can we move this forward? We have to do this reporting. It's not optional. We have to get this done. And actually, when you dig into it, it's not always about how the data is stored. It's about how the products are designed right at the beginning. So doing it through this mechanism, doing it through capability assessment, means that you look at everything together. You don't always just have to look at a database and why you don't have the data in a database and then go back to system. Where is it stored in a system? Because like I said before, a lot of our due diligence that we do still on a spreadsheet that's stored in a file. So we have these processes that are, I'm not going to say old processes, but we're using technology that is available to us at the time, and because of that, it's making consumer duty reporting almost impossible in some places. So it requires a lot of manual work to design, and that might be right for the organisation, that once we know that it comes from these 24 spreadsheets, we can manually create the data, but until you look at the way that the data is produced, the way that everything is stored, the way that it all hangs together, how many other people we've got coming together, you can't produce that reporting for MI. So it's a massive driver, and it's a great point to say we have to produce this stuff. How can we do it, and how can we make it work really well?
I think it's fair to say that actually the MI problems, everyone tends to blame the technology, or they tend to blame the kind of data capture or the cover holder that's submitting the bordereau. Actually, when we've done a lot of these capability assessments, a lot of it is the internal processes. Mm-hmm. So things like there are no push to cover holders, there's no validation of mapping into bordereau management solutions, there's no clear understanding of what fields are required for onward reporting. Most of it isn't poor data quality, it's actually poor process around managing data. And I think that's really, really important. So where you think the problem is might not actually be where the problem ends up following a capability assessment. Claire, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the role of compliance now is kind of morphed into a data role. I would just say that compliance did words, not numbers. Now compliance people are expected to do numbers, and what the problem is, they can't extract. And often it's not a criticism, but often compliance people don't know the right questions to ask, or the right basis for some of the data that's being produced. Quite often, you ask for a loss ratio, or some people would calculate that slightly differently, and so the compliance officers have got this new expectation where they need to be able to talk the data language. And I think it's so important for people on your side of the business, Karen and Becky, to help compliance officers that's never been their job before, to help them map out some of those requirements and know what they should be asking for. And I've seen some great stuff from you guys in particular around that bordereau mapping and that data dictionary, and making it really clear about what that data means and what it should be used for. And I think coming together of that that data strategy and compliance is actually really, really critical. And I feel for compliance officers, particularly in these smaller firms, of not having the expertise to be able to lean on, and the data teams being busy running with their processes and not bringing those things together. And I think there's a lot of education that both of these firms can, functions can do for each other to help make that process work much better.
Yep. So in conclusion, if you were to give 3 key pieces of advice to firms considering undertaking a capability assessment or independent review, what would that advice be? And I will go to Becky first.
First piece of advice is bring someone in independent. Make sure you've got the right partner that works for your organisation. The second piece of advice is make sure you look across all of those pillars that I mentioned. Don't just look at technology, don't just look at data, and don't just look at organisation. Make sure you look at everything as a whole all together. And my third one is make sure if you put the time and the effort and the money behind this to do a capability assessment, do something with it. Listen to the advice. You may not agree with the advice, you can go against it, but you can make a decision to do that. But make sure you do something with it and don't just let it sit on a shelf for years.
Thanks, Becky. Claire, what would your advice be?
I think the overarching piece of advice is be clear on what outcomes you want to achieve rather than task. If you want to reinvigorate your MI infrastructure, your data strategy, then be clear about that's the outcome and what is that going to look like, and be clear about that, and not so much just on specific. We've got a problem here. What do you want it to look like at the end of it? And I think that encapsulates most things across the board. To be clear about that and make sure you're looking at outcomes, not specific actions.
I think mine would be understand where you want to be, what you're trying to get out of this. Do you want to be a market leader? Do you want to gain competitive advantage? Do you just want to make sure that you're compliant and have a view of your appetite? Make sure there's strong business leadership and that the firm have got the time and resources to allocate to this. To do a successful capability assessment, we do need to talk to people within the business. They do need to spend time with us. They do need to have honest, open conversations around where the challenges are, and we will represent those in our findings report, but that does take time and effort. So I think that's really important. And again, I think echoing back to once you've done a capability assessment, you need to have a plan about what you want to do with it. We've got plenty of examples where they sat on a shelf. We've got plenty of examples which have launched large transformation programs. But we've also got plenty of examples of people that would like to do large transformation programs, don't have the budget, but can actually spend the next 6 months after a capability assessment making small tweaks to generate improvements within the businesses. So things don't have to necessarily be done immediately. They just have to have an intention and can be operated within a BAU environment. It hasn't necessarily got to be a project. So I think it's making sure that there's action off the back of the findings that we find. So thanks, guys, for joining us. Thank you for listening to us. And we hope you now have a better understanding of how a capability assessment can help drive improved performance for your business, how it encompasses all areas of an organisation, including people, process, procedures, technology and data. And you understand that every firm will have a different appetite for capability, and that ultimately these types of assessments can be scaled to meet the individual needs of your business. Thanks for joining. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Ask the Experts with Green Kite, and we hope that you've gained some valuable insights which help you steer your insurance journey with confidence. Remember that for every complex question, there's always a clear answer just waiting to be unearthed. Join us next time as we continue to decode the intricacies of the insurance world. More expertise on demand? If you need it, then visit our website. Take care and see you all on the next episode.